Hi everybody, I want to make a video about why I think modern agriculture is completely unsustainable. The first thing we want to do is define what modern agriculture is and where it came from. And I think that story begins with um, the European method of slash and burn agriculture, where they took rich forest lands, cut small swaths of them to expose the soil, the fertile, good quality soil full of organic matter that was very good at growing the production crops that the peoples of Europe needed. And they sustained themselves through this way of cutting out portions of forest, exposing the rich fertile land, and then farming that. As that land becomes depleted, they move on, let the forest reclaim that in its several hundred, maybe 1,000 year cycle of replenishing the fertility of that soil, and then they move on to another chunk of it. Well, this is a successful way of farming. It's a way of creating a lot of people, but unfortunately, it's also a way of depleting the land that needs a regeneration cycle that takes a very long time. So what ends up happening is that Europe becomes deforested and overpopulated. The soils no longer can hold the population, and you begin to see problems with health, problems with starvation, problems with all sorts of crop failures due to a myriad of reasons, but basically depleted soils. Colonialism, one of the very first things they did, and a lot of people don't think about this, is they set up plantations all over the world to mine the native soils that were still rich in fertility. So you'll see in the Caribbean all sorts of sugar plantations. In Africa, you have coffee and tea plantations. But within all these, there's all sorts of other crops being raised. And it takes a lot of the stress off of the European systems so that they can do some more of their crops without the added tax of all these other areas. And truthfully, there was a lot of luxury items, sugar, coffee, tea, and things of this nature that were better in other climates. And so that was part of it as well. But a big portion of this was that the soils of Europe were becoming depleted, and they had manners of regenerating them through rotation. But the stress that their population was putting on them was too great. So they went to other areas and they started exploiting the farmland there. And you see this all over America, all over the Caribbean, all over Africa and Asia. And what essentially happens is that as these lands become depleted, they start to mine uh, salt fertilizers. In the 1850s, a guy named Alexander Liebig, a German chemist, proposed and I guess proved that you can take organic matter, you can take life and break it down into its chemical components. And this is essentially how you can maintain it, is through these chemical components and understanding of this, that you can basically build life together again, kind of Frankenstein together through all these different chemicals that life, that he's boiled, take a little bit of life, boiled it down, found out which chemicals are in it. And they said, if we feed the chemicals back to these life, the life will incorporate them and essentially will go past the biological systems that were in place to directly feed the plants this chemistry. And so a lot of what we were doing with the loss of fertility through slash and burn agriculture, we were replacing through a chemical form of agriculture that was feeding the plants the salts that they needed, the nutrients they needed, and also replacing some of the gases they needed. So a lot of fertility is based on nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen being pushed into the soil through atmospheric pressure. And this happens when the soil is soft and full of organic matter, when the soil is fertile. As the soil loses fertility, it begins to harden. And then this, in particular, nitrogen, doesn't get pushed back into it. And what you have is nitrogen depletion. This is one of the most primary and problematic aspects of modern agriculture. And so they mine nitrogen through all sorts of different ways, mostly through bird poop, interestingly enough. And they found an island somewhere that was literally hundreds of feet thick in bird poo. And this became the world's nitrogen source for a short period of time until that was depleted. But in the 1850s, they figured out a way to chemically bond nitrogen so that they could create a pellet out of it, holding nitrogen, which is a very light gas and wants to jump into the atmosphere, escape. They could hold it in this pellet form and give it to the land where it would slowly break down and replace the nitrogen that was being pushed in as a gas. Now, as we do these chemical methods, one of the things that occurs is that the organic matter in the soil begins to deplete. That's its fertility. Without fertilizers, without kind of man messing around with things, nature provides the nutrients that a plant needs through organic matter. The microbes and the fungus break down old living matter and regenerate it into a fresh, fertile living matter that they can then feed to the plants. So as the plant needs a little manganese or a little calcium or any of the nutrients it may need, the microbes will provide that, and then the plant will come and deliver a little bit of carbon to these microbes and fungus, because that's what they're all looking for. The salts are easy. If they have the organic matter, they can break down these salts and just feed it to the plant. What they're looking for is carbon. That's the most fundamental element that life needs, and that's what's given by the plants. They mine that out of the air, the CO2, they take the oxygen off, throw it back out, and then they create their substance out of this carbon, but they also feed a little bit of that back into the ground to help to create a currency of exchange for the microbes and fungus that are feeding them their nutrients. As they get a little bit of manganese, a little bit of calcium, they give it a little bit of carbon back. This is called an exudate. It's the plant giving the currency of carbon back to the soil. And this will build up the carbon in the soil. And this carbon creates the structure of the soil. The organic matter begins to, and I use those terms a little bit interchangeably, maybe I shouldn't, organic matter and carbon. But as this organic matter begins to build up in the soil, the microbes will just create more, the roots will just create more. It's this endless cycle where as the plants take the carbon out of the air and give it to the soil, the amount of organic matter in the soil begins to rise up. And then as the plant dies, this big carbon structure comes down into the ground, and the plant and the soil digests that as well. At the end of the day, all the carbon that was taken in by the plant ends up back on the ground being digested. And a lot of times animals come in the way of this, and they just augment that process more by breaking down that organic matter even quicker for even quicker digestion by the soil. So this whole process in nature is a virtuous cycle where the organic matter just begins to pile up, pile up, pile up. Now, with the slash and burn agriculture, they would come across this incredibly fertile land, and they would start to do these depletionary methods of agriculture. And in order to get to more fertile land, they had to till the soil, to take what's called a moldboard plow, easy for me to say, and invert the soil, taking the top 6 inches foot and inverting it and exposing the bottom 6 inches underneath that, because that was more fertile. It wasn't as depleted as the soil on top. And this method of agriculture is basically mining the fertility out of the soil, and eventually it will deplete it all. And what you'll be left with is the carbon, which was the organic matter, which was giving the soil structure, is depleted, and you're just left with uh, compacted salts and clay, earth. Earth without organic matter doesn't sustain life, and that's where we were at. So we started to feed the plants directly with fertilizers. And this will work for a period of time. But eventually you end up in a place where several things happen. You end up with too much salts on the land and not enough carbon and not enough life to sustain this whole process. And you get a toxic salt buildup. But what's way more pressing is that you break the water cycle of the soil. Soil holds moisture through organic matter. The microbes and the fungus use the organic matter almost like pillars to create structures within the soil so that the soil will hold way more air, way more water. There's a bunch of biospace within the soil that the organic matter creates. And as that organic matter is taken out, all those salts just compact, and you're left with something that doesn't hold water, where the water runs off of the top. It creates a hard barrier on top. And we've all seen this, where the top of the soil is hard, and when the water hits it, it doesn't go in, it just runs off. This is what happens to soil without its organic matter that's been depleted. And now you're looking at a broken water cycle. And this has a lot of very extreme consequences because life needs water. So as this water cycle is depleted, you get to a place where you have to irrigate. And then you're providing plants the water directly because the soil is no longer holding it, and the organic matter is no longer helping in that process. So you need a lot more water because it's not penetrating except where the roots are. And this is causing a lot of the water to run off. This is borrowing a lot of water from our river systems and breaking them. And more importantly, the climate or the weather changes that are going to be occurring to this are going to be extreme and catastrophic. When you have millions of acres holding a huge amount of moisture through feet of topsoil, and then let's say the natural environment or the pre-European conquest of America, the native soils of the prairies were tremendously fertile, and they were kept fertile through the buffalo ranges and the predators that worked the buffalo. And there was a huge cycle, a virtuous cycle, where the soil was just building organic matter. So by the time we came around, it was many, many feet in many places of organic matter that was just building and building and building. And of course, we start to deplete this and this and that. But what happens is that in that natural cycle, the amount of water being held on the land is tremendous. And then there's a very rich agriculture of natural plants that are feeding that moisture back into the atmosphere. And it's a double-edged sword because they're holding the moisture into the soil, but they're also slowly feeding it back in. There's a beautiful area in the water cycle where the soil is both holding the moisture and slowly giving it back into the atmosphere. And what happens is that large amounts of land have a slow evaporation rate that's feeding the moisture in the atmosphere. Well, when all of this water no longer stays on the land and runs off into the waterways, you have water concentrated into the waterways, and where it was slowly respirating back into the atmosphere, all that's gone. And now all the evaporation is happening intensively in the areas where the water has accumulated. So what you're doing now is you have intense areas of evaporation with large stretches of area with no evaporation. So the water is rushing in the atmosphere. The water is rushing, trying to balance these things out, trying to balance the lows and the high pressures out, because everything is becoming more extreme because of this the gradual system of evaporation that we had, and then with the plains being rich in fertility is gone now. And so we're left with more violent and aggressive weather systems. This is going to be prone to more droughts, more extreme weather, and all the phenomena that we're seeing that they're blaming for all sorts of reasons. The factories billow out too much smoke, but really, if you were to ask me, the number one reason, it's quite obvious, is the depletion of the organic matter in the land, that we're ruining our agricultural lands. The most fertile aspects of our world, we've depleted tremendously, and now we're dealing with broken water cycles. And this will be the end of it. We can't sustain these systems. Now that we've already gone to irrigation to this extent that many of the water systems are being broken, because if the land isn't holding the water, bringing water from outside sources just to run off the land is a short-term fix. This isn't going to get you where you need to go, because long-term, you're not evaporating from the soil itself. So this will always become more extreme as the weather patterns become more aggressive, the droughts become more extreme, and on and on and on. It's a vicious cycle of depletion where the weather is just going to become more extreme, and the agricultural lands that we're now using are going to become more depleted and harder to keep moist, and eventually break down entirely. And this is a very scary prospect because it's happening right now. We're in the San Joaquin Valley, in some of the most productive farmland in the US, over in California, they're in 20-year droughts. And this is going to get worse. There may be little blips where things get better, but for the most part, the water systems are broken. And so what you're going to see is this cycle becoming more and more extreme. And as it does, more and more farmland is going to come offline, because you can't just meter it out where you give farms a little bit less, because eventually you reach a point where the crops die. So you take farms offline and you just produce less food, because you can only produce what you can water. So eventually you end up in a cycle where the existing waterways are being overtaxed. The land is running right off. And one of the direct consequences of all this is that the fertilizers And then the pesticides and all the other salts that we add to the soil to help things grow get washed away once the rains do come because they're not held into the soil. So all of that goes into the waterways with it. And as we find out, we end up with toxic pollution problems in our waterways. And this is from the agricultural salts of our land being washed in because our water systems are broken. This is going to be the end of our modern agricultural system eventually. This will be the thing that breaks it, in my opinion. Even though there's a lot of things that could. There's a lot of areas where the land becomes what they call alkali. It just becomes too alkaline to grow anything, and that's because of a salt buildup, mostly because of what we do. Now, there's instances in nature where these salt buildups occur naturally and the soil goes naturally alkali. But once soil is alkali, it's very hard and very expensive and really not worth the, the juice for the squeeze to fix this land. Once you poison it and it goes alkali, it's kind of the end of it. And this is one of the issues with modern agriculture, is that it will eventually turn to this. But I think well before that happens, we're going to have a water problem. And I think we're in the midst of it. How do we fix this? Well, we have to change our agricultural practices so that they're more in line with nature's desire to build up organic matter. We have to recognize organic matter is the best way to fertilize the plants. Salts lead to pesticides because when you take away all the microbes and fungus that are feeding the plants, those were the microbes and fungus that were protecting the plants as well. And all of the decay cycle of bacteria and all the things that want to eat that for its carbon value were being held off by microbes and fungus that were protecting the plant, saying, hey, no, this plant is going to bring carbon. This is mining carbon. This is special. We don't eat this for its carbon value quite yet because it's bringing carbon in from the atmosphere, is mining our carbon. So we are going to protect this. And the decay cycle, microbes and all the different things that would decompose this are held at bay. And it's a system where they want the carbon mined as well, so they're willing to go off this. But once you take all the life out of it and you feed it directly, you take away these natural buffers, so the plant doesn't have all of the different protection elements that the organic matter and the life in that organic matter we're giving to it. Now you have to use pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, or I guess they're all pesticides, but you have to use herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides to kill the unwanted elements that are now creeping up everywhere because there's nothing to stop them in the biological world that we've depleted here. So now we have to use the pesticides. We have to use something to control the life we don't want because it's going to be consuming everything that we are growing because, like I say, it has no biological protections, it has no biological buffers. So you end up with a system where when you do fertilize, you pretty much have to use pesticides eventually because of this depletion. You will eventually have to use irrigation because of this depletion. And what you're left with is a system that eventually breaks. And people will say, well, how are we going to feed 8 billion people if our agriculture systems that are based on mass production don't work anymore? And the simple answer is that more of us need to work small farms. More of us need to work small gardens. 2.6% of the population producing the food will never work. Throughout all of history, 70% or so of the population were involved with the production of food, be it animal husbandry or land husbandry in the form of agricultural production, farming, and things of this nature. Way more of us have to be doing this. The industrial model that we relied on isn't working, it's broken, and it will continue to break until catastrophic results. We need to commandeer this system. We need to become farmers and gardeners ourselves. We need to reintroduce the victory garden because soon there may be a problem with fresh vegetables and meats on the shelves. This is our reality. We've created a system that we've grown the world into an 8 billion person phenomena, and these systems can't sustain us. We have to revert back to other systems, and they exist. This is the crazy thing. The slash and burn agricultural method of the West that we inherited that turned into the chemical system is not the only system. And historically, there's some great examples of other systems, specifically China, Korea, and Japan, through the 4 millennia that they've been successfully sustaining their agricultural systems up until about 100 years ago, when they went to fertilizer, pesticide, all of the other systems. But back in the day, and China was a great example, and so I'll just use them as the example to run with here. They had a system of canals that went through their farmland, and the people that lived on these canals were the cities that lived on them basically took all of their waste, all of their carbon matter, their what they would call night matter, night something or another. But basically, they're pooing their piss. But everything else, if they had leftover food or the husks from their food, if they changed their roof out, if they changed their bedding mat out, all of that stuff was organic matter, and they threw it in the canals, and it got sent down the canals to the farms at the end of the season. And by the way, they have these incredible pump systems, manual pump systems, to just keep pushing this water down. And then when it gets to the farmland down the canals, at the end of the season, the canals will begin to dry out. They'll take all of this organic matter, bring it to the banks, dry it out, and then spread it on the fields. And this is the humus, the organic matter, and it sustained their fields for millennia. It's the book I read about this was called Farmers of 40 Centuries. And it's how basically a very small amount of land was able to feed and help populate in a very dense manner this region in a way that was completely sustainable. There was no loss of fertility. This practice went on for many, many, many generations, and it didn't break. And the cycles that were created by it were virtuous: better water cycles, better land fertility. And this whole movement of taking the organic matter that we created, the waste that we created, and putting it back on the fields. This is true fertilizer. This is humus, as they would say. Not hummus, not the delicious Mediterranean dip made of chickpeas, but humus. And this is broken down organic matter that is ready to be fed to the plants. This is ready for the microbes just to take those nutrients and give it right to the plants. And then they feed off this organic matter as they do it, sustain themselves, build populations of these bacteria and microbes and fungus, which will give the plants everything it needs. And this system could be implemented today. We just need more people to do it. We need to realize that our organic matter is precious. Everything that we put in the trash can that stinks, we should be putting someplace else, because that needs to go back on the land. We need to basically go to a system of composting our matter to put back on the fields, and supplement our use of fertilizers with this. This is regenerative agriculture, but it's more than that, because regenerative agricultural principles are a process of cycling agricultural systems so that the land grows its organic matter like a natural process. This is more of an immediate push. This is what Albert Howard, the father of regenerative agriculture, kind of envisioned, is that the cities and the population areas that make a lot of waste would take that waste and put that back into the agricultural sphere, where it would then be used as the way to manually grow the organic matter in the soil. Because truthfully, regenerative practices are great, and that's what we have to be doing. But the soils are so far depleted that we're past that. We need an injection of humus. And basically, we need to become hot composters. We need to become people who compost our materials to put them on the field in what would be called sheet composting, where you just spread a lot of compost. You manually add the carbon to the ground. You manually add the organic matter to the ground. And then you create virtuous cycles that will hold this organic matter and slowly build it up over time. But just to start slowly building up organic matter over time, when the land is basically completely denuded of the organic matter, it's going to take a very long time. It's going to start very slowly. Yes, in 20 years, you will have some good momentum. I think Gabe Brown's farm, after 20 or 30 years of regenerative practices, has gotten to 13% organic matter. Joel Salatin, I think, was like at 10 or 11% after about 40 years of good regenerative um, agricultural principles. This is too long, and too much of our land is in too bad a shape, and our waterways are our water systems are too broken to go with this. We need a more aggressive way of going about this. We need to realize that all of our organic matter, all of our waste is precious. It needs to go back on the land. And there are other aspects of this too with the hot compost, that a lot of our organic matter, as we know, is toxic. We have created all sorts of what I'll call decay resistant substances in the form of PFAS, plastics, things that just don't break down easily in our environment. That's why we did it. We need things like countertops that don't that aren't wooden break down. We need cups made of plastic. We need plates made of things that are going to be there forever until we break them. And so with these things, as these things get slowly mixed into our waste, they begin to corrupt the carbon chains of our organic matter. And the way to solve this problem is composting. When you hot compost something, you take thermophilic bacteria, the most primordial, most digesting substance in all of nature, and it breaks down that organic matter, and it reforms the carbon chains that is organic matter. And as it does that, it drops away the things that don't belong, the toxins. It reforms these carbon chains into new carbon chains. And this process purifies the substance, purifies the organic matter that you're going to be using. And that's something we're in desperate need of, because all of our waste is pretty well toxic at this stage. We need to wash it, clean it, and then feed it back into the land. And then we need to stop making these decay resistant substances. But that's going to be a slow process. Way before we can get the political will to stop that, we have to start taking that matter out of our organic matter so we can put it on the fields. Because before any sort of pollution problems creep up on us, we're going to end up with broken water cycles. Our fields will go dry. And that's what we have to address first and foremost. We need organic matter on the fields. We have to turn away from the chemical side of farming and go back to an older way of farming involving organic matter and the placing of good, healthy carbon that living matter, living microbes can process and feed to our plants. Anyway, I'm going on for a little bit. I'm gonna make another video about other aspects of chemical agriculture and potentially why this is at the root of our current health epidemics. Because the same aspects where the buffers that the microbes and fungus give plants to protect them from nature have been eradicated, that's going on in us too now. Our systems are biologically broken because the microbes that create buffers in our gut and help our immune system are broken. We haven't been feeding them living matter for so long that they've strayed, and now we're all dealing with autoimmune disorders. And that's the next video. I want to talk all about how the health problems of these broken agricultural systems. This was more about the macro. The next video will be about the micro problems. Anyway, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it.